This dramatization is based on real events, but some details have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved. The purpose is educational, showing how seemingly minor conflicts can escalate when dialogue and understanding are abandoned. In the summer of 1994, the Bronx carried scars that ran deeper than its burned-out buildings and graffiti-covered walls. Hunts Point, a neighborhood where hope and despair walked hand-in-hand down cracked sidewalks, had become a testing ground for America's war on drugs, a war being fought in the streets, in the schools, and in the hearts of families watching their children disappear into a world of quick money and quicker death. This is the story of Reverend Marcus Washington, a man whose faith once moved mountains, but whose world crumbled when those same mountains fell on his son. What happened in the months following 17-year-old David Washington's overdose would shake a community to its core and force everyone to confront an uncomfortable question. When the system fails to protect the innocent, how far is too far in the pursuit of what feels like justice? Through police interviews, community testimonies, and personal journals discovered years later, we piece together a tale that transcends simple notions of right and wrong. This is not a story about heroes and villains. It's about a father's love, a community's silence, and the dangerous path that opens when grief transforms into something else entirely. The events depicted occurred over 8 months in 1994-1995. Names and specific locations have been altered to protect privacy, but the emotional truth of this story, drawn from extensive research and community interviews, remains intact. Before we begin, we'd like to ask you to tell us your name and the city you're watching from. We love getting to know our audience. Also, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. That way, we can keep bringing you more stories like this one. The morning David Washington died, his father was preparing a sermon about redemption. Reverend Marcus Washington stood at the pulpit of New Covenant Baptist Church at 5:47 a.m., as he had every Sunday for the past 12 years, watching the early light filter through stained glass windows that had somehow survived 3 decades of urban decay in Hunts Point. The sanctuary could hold 200 souls, though these days it rarely saw more than 60 on a good Sunday. Still, Marcus treated every sermon as if he were addressing thousands. Redemption, he spoke aloud to the empty pews, testing the word's weight. The act of saving or being saved from sin, error, or evil. His voice carried the deep, measured cadence that had made him a pillar of the community, a voice that could quiet crying babies during baptisms and command attention at community board meetings where politicians made promises they'd forget by Tuesday. At 43, Marcus Washington was everything Hunts Point needed in a spiritual leader: steady, uncompromising, and genuinely invested in the neighborhood's survival. The sermon notes spread across the lectern detailed his planned message about second chances, about how God's grace could lift anyone from any circumstance. He'd written it thinking about Mrs. Rodriguez's grandson, who'd been caught selling marijuana outside PS 48, and about Tommy Chen, whose family was struggling with his father's gambling addiction. Marcus believed deeply in the power of transformation, that no one was beyond saving if they truly wanted to change. He never imagined he'd be delivering this sermon 12 hours after holding his own son's cold body in a hospital emergency room. The call came at 2:17 a.m. Marcus would remember that detail with crystalline clarity for the rest of his life, because he'd been staring at the alarm clock, unable to sleep, wondering why David hadn't come home. At 17, David was technically old enough to make his own choices, but he'd always been respectful about curfews, always called if he'd be late. The ringing phone in the pre-dawn darkness sent ice through Marcus's veins before he even lifted the receiver. "Reverend Washington, this is Dr. Chen at Lincoln Hospital. I need you to come in immediately. It's about your son." The drive through empty Bronx streets felt like moving through water. Marcus's hands gripped the steering wheel of his 15-year-old Honda Civic, a car he maintained meticulously because it was all the church could afford to provide, while his wife Gloria sat silent beside him, her lips moving in prayer. They'd been married 19 years, had built their life around service to others, had raised David to be respectful, intelligent, and aware of the dangers that lurked in their neighborhood. David was supposed to be the success story, the kid who made it out. Lincoln Hospital's emergency room on a Saturday night was a war zone of human misery. Gunshot victims, overdoses, domestic violence cases, and the walking wounded of urban America filled every corner. Marcus had been here before, visiting parishioners, comforting families, offering prayers over dying gang members whose mothers begged God for one more chance. He knew the smell of antiseptic mixed with fear, knew the particular fluorescent pallor that made everyone look like ghosts. Dr. Chen was a small woman with kind eyes and the exhausted demeanor of someone who'd seen too much. She led them to a quiet corner, and Marcus knew before she spoke what words would come next. "I'm sorry. We did everything we could. Your son was brought in approximately an hour ago. It appears to be a heroin overdose. He was already gone when the paramedics arrived." Gloria collapsed. Not dramatically, not with screaming or thrashing, but like a marionette whose strings had been cut. She simply folded inward, and Marcus caught her, held her, while his own world quietly ended. They let him see David in a small, sterile room where his son looked impossibly young and peaceful. The boy who'd been talking about college applications just 3 weeks earlier, who'd been accepted to Fordham University with a partial scholarship, who'd planned to study social work because he wanted to help kids in neighborhoods like theirs. David's face showed no signs of struggle, no indication of the battle that had ended his life. He looked like he was sleeping. Marcus touched his son's forehead, still warm, and felt something fundamental break inside his chest. Not his heart exactly, but something deeper. Something that had to do with faith and trust and the basic assumption that if you lived right, if you taught right, if you loved right, your children would be safe. The police officer who took their statement was sympathetic but matter of fact. Detective Rodriguez, no relation to the Mrs. Rodriguez from church, explained that David had been found in an abandoned building on Tiffany Street, a location known for drug activity. There had been 3 other kids there, all unconscious, though the others had survived. The heroin had been particularly pure, particularly deadly, a bad batch that had killed 4 people in the South Bronx that night. "Did you know your son was using drugs, Reverend?" Marcus stared at the detective. "David was a good kid, honor roll volunteer work, college-bound. He didn't—" He stopped, realizing how hollow those words sounded in a place where good kids died every week. "Sometimes the good kids are the ones who surprise you," Rodriguez said gently. "Sometimes they're trying drugs for the first time, don't know their limits. Sometimes they're just in the wrong place with the wrong people." Wrong place, wrong people. Marcus had spent 12 years preaching about making good choices, about avoiding temptation, about the importance of surrounding yourself with positive influences. Had David not been listening? Or had Marcus not been paying attention? They drove home as the sun rose over the Bronx, turning the sky the color of rust above abandoned buildings and struggling bodegas. Gloria hadn't spoken since the hospital. She sat curved into herself, occasionally making small sounds that might have been prayers or might have been something else entirely. Their apartment sat above Mrs. Chen's laundromat, not the doctor from the hospital, but an elderly Chinese woman who'd lived in the neighborhood for 40 years and treated Marcus and Gloria like family. The smell of industrial detergent and fabric softener usually comforted Marcus, reminded him that even in a place that felt forgotten by the world, people still tried to keep things clean, still maintained dignity and order. This morning, it just smelled like chemicals. Marcus sat at their small kitchen table, while Gloria went directly to David's room and closed the door. He could hear her moving around in there, and he knew she was touching David's things, his books, his clothes, the basketball trophies from junior year when he'd been starting point guard before deciding to focus on academics instead. The sermon notes were still in Marcus's jacket pocket. He pulled them out, read his own handwriting about redemption and second chances, and felt something twist in his stomach. How do you preach about God's plan when that plan includes good kids dying from poison purchased on street corners? How do you talk about hope when hope had just been buried under fluorescent lights in a hospital morgue? The phone started ringing at 8 a.m. News traveled fast in their neighborhood, and the congregation began calling to offer condolences, to ask about funeral arrangements, to wonder if there would be services today. Marcus let the machine pick up. He wasn't ready to be Reverend Washington yet. He wasn't sure he'd ever be ready again. By 10 a.m., people started showing up at their door. Mrs. Rodriguez from church bringing food. Tommy Chen's mother offering to help with arrangements. Deacon Williams asking quietly if Marcus needed someone to handle today's service. The love was genuine, overwhelming, and somehow made everything worse. "Reverend," Mrs. Rodriguez said, setting a covered dish on the counter, "David was such a good boy. Such a good boy. This don't make no sense." That's when Marcus asked the question that would change everything. Where did he get it? Mrs. Rodriguez looked uncomfortable. "Reverend, you don't want to go down that road. Police will handle—" "Where did my son get the drugs that killed him?" The silence in the kitchen stretched until Deacon Williams cleared his throat. "Marcus, you're grieving. You're not thinking clear. Let the authorities—" "The authorities just told me my honest student son died shooting heroin in a crack house. So forgive me if I don't have much faith in their ability to handle anything." It was Mrs. Rodriguez who finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "They say it's that crew operates out of the old Murphy building, but Reverend, you can't—" "I'm not planning anything," Marcus said, though even as he spoke the words, he wasn't sure they were true. "I just want to understand." After everyone left, Marcus sat alone in his kitchen and realized he was already planning something. Not revenge exactly, not violence, but something. Some kind of action that would make David's death mean something beyond tragedy, beyond one more statistic in the war on drugs that everyone was losing. He thought about the Murphy building 3 blocks away. He'd walked past it countless times, had seen the young men who lingered on its corners, had noticed how conversation stopped when he approached in his collar and suit. He'd always assumed it was respect for his position, but now he wondered if it had been something else entirely. How many times had David walked past that building? How many times had those same young men seen the preacher's son and thought, what? Opportunity? Challenge? Easy money from a naive college boy with access to his parents' modest savings? Marcus pulled out a pen and began writing on the back of his sermon notes. Not a sermon this time, but a list. Names of young men he'd seen around the Murphy building, license plates he'd noticed, patterns of activity he'd observed without really thinking about them. He'd spent 12 years trying to save souls through prayer and scripture. Maybe it was time to try a different approach. When Gloria emerged from David's room that evening, holding one of his textbooks, she found Marcus sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by notebooks, street maps, and what looked like surveillance notes. "Marcus," she said softly, "what are you doing?" He looked up at his wife, saw the grief and confusion in her eyes, and felt the weight of the decision he was making. "I'm trying to understand how we failed him." "We didn't fail him, Marcus. David made a choice." "Did he?" Marcus's voice carried an edge that Gloria had never heard before. "Or was the choice made for him by people who saw an opportunity and took it?" Gloria set David's textbook on the table. It was his sociology textbook, and it fell open to a chapter about social systems and institutional failure. "What are you going to do?" Marcus looked down at his notes, then back at his wife. "I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else's child." It sounded noble when he said it. It sounded like ministry, like service, like the kind of thing Reverend Marcus Washington would do. It would take months for him to realize he'd already stopped being that man, had already begun transforming into something else entirely. Something that would terrify the people who'd killed his son far more than any police investigation ever could. The funeral was held on a Thursday because the church calendar was already booked solid. Marcus stood at the pulpit where he'd delivered hundreds of sermons, looking out at a congregation that had swelled to nearly 300 people, more than the sanctuary had seen since Christmas of 1991. They came from all over the South Bronx, teachers from David's high school, kids from the neighborhood basketball courts, elderly church members who remembered baptizing David as an infant, and people Marcus had never seen before who simply understood that when a good family loses a child to the streets, the entire community shares the wound. David lay in a simple wooden casket that had cost more than Marcus made in 2 months. The church had taken up collections, the neighborhood had pooled resources, and somehow they'd managed to give the boy a funeral that reflected the hopes everyone had carried for his future rather than the reality of his death. White roses covered the casket, and David looked peaceful in his only suit, the one he'd worn to his high school graduation 3 months earlier. Marcus had prepared remarks about God's mysterious plan, about finding meaning in tragedy, about the importance of supporting one another through grief. Standard funeral language that he'd used dozens of times for other families facing similar losses. But when the moment came to speak, standing before David's casket with Gloria weeping quietly in the front row, different words came out. "My son was murdered," he said, and the sanctuary fell completely silent. Not by a gunman, not by violence in the traditional sense, but by a system that treats our children like customers and their lives like profit margins. David didn't choose to die. He was killed by people who saw a 17-year-old college-bound kid and decided his future was worth less than their immediate profit. Deacon Williams shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This wasn't the healing message the community needed to hear. This was something else, something angry and raw and potentially dangerous. "I've stood in this pulpit for 12 years talking about forgiveness, about turning the other cheek, about trusting in God's justice. Today I'm wondering if God's justice sometimes requires human hands to carry it out." After the service, after the burial, after the last casserole had been delivered and the final condolence offered, Marcus found himself alone with a decision that would define the rest of his life. He could grieve normally, accept David's death as a tragic but random event, and focus on healing his family and his community through traditional means. Or he could do something else. The choice became clear 3 days later when he attended his first community board meeting since David's death. The meeting was held in the basement of PS 48, the elementary school where David had once been a straight-A student. 27 people showed up to discuss neighborhood concerns, broken streetlights, irregular garbage collection, the ongoing problem of drug activity around several buildings, including the Murphy complex. Marcus sat in the back, listening as residents described the same problems he'd been hearing about for years. "My daughter can't walk to school without seeing drug deals," said Mrs. Patterson, a woman whose family had lived in Hunts Point for 3 generations. "These kids are getting younger and younger, and the police don't do nothing." Officer Stevens, the community liaison, offered the same response Marcus had heard dozens of times. "We're aware of the situation. We encourage residents to call in suspicious activity. Our hands are tied without witness cooperation." Witness cooperation, Marcus almost laughed. In a neighborhood where witnesses had a habit of disappearing or getting their windows broken, cooperation was a luxury most families couldn't afford. The code of silence wasn't about loyalty to criminals, it was about survival. "What about the Murphy building?" asked Mr. Rodriguez, father of the boy who'd been caught with marijuana. "Everyone knows what goes on there. Why can't you just shut it down?" "We need evidence of ongoing criminal activity. We need witnesses willing to testify. You need to do your job," said a voice from the middle of the room, and Marcus realized it was his own. The room turned to look at him. Officer Stevens, a decent man who genuinely cared about the community but was constrained by bureaucracy and limited resources, nodded respectfully. "Reverend Washington, I'm sorry for your loss. I know this is a difficult time." Marcus stood up slowly. "My son died from drugs purchased 3 blocks from this school. Drugs sold by an organization that operates openly, that recruits children, that treats this neighborhood like occupied territory. And you're telling us your hands are tied because you need witnesses." "Reverend," Stephen said carefully, "I understand your anger, but we have to follow proper procedures." "Proper procedures?" Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. "How many more kids have to die while you follow proper procedures?" That night, Marcus began what he would later think of as his real education, learning about the enemy that had killed his son. He started by walking. Every evening after Gloria went to bed, Marcus would leave their apartment and walk the streets of Hunts Point, observing patterns he'd never paid attention to before. He learned that drug operations functioned like legitimate businesses, with hierarchies, territories, and sophisticated distribution networks. He learned that the Murphy building was just one location in a larger organization that controlled several blocks and employed dozens of young men from the neighborhood. He learned that David hadn't been a random victim, he'd been a deliberate target. The information came from unexpected sources. Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who owned the laundromat below their apartment, had been watching the neighborhood change for 40 years. She knew which buildings were controlled by which crews, which kids were selling and which were buying, which families had lost children to overdoses and which had lost them to bullets. "Your boy," she said one evening as Marcus helped her carry laundry upstairs. "He was asking questions before he died. About that building, about how things work. Someone told him something, made him curious." Marcus stopped walking. "What kind of questions?" Mrs. Chen looked around nervously, then spoke in a whisper. "He wanted to know why police never arrest the boss men, only the little kids. He wanted to know who was protecting them. He said he was writing some kind of paper for school about social systems. A sociology project. David had been researching the drug trade for a school assignment and had gotten too close to something dangerous. Or someone had seen an opportunity to eliminate a potential threat by getting the preacher's son hooked on drugs, sending a message to the community about the consequences of asking questions. The more Marcus learned, the more systematic the corruption appeared. The drug organization didn't just sell narcotics, they provided a parallel economy for a neighborhood that legitimate businesses had largely abandoned. They employed teenagers who saw no other path to economic advancement. They offered protection to residents who couldn't rely on police response. They had infiltrated local politics, local business, and yes, local churches. Marcus discovered this last fact during a conversation with Deacon Williams that took place 3 weeks after the funeral. "I need to ask you something," Marcus said as they sat in the church office on a Wednesday evening, going over financial records that told the story of a congregation struggling to survive. "The church's mortgage payments. How are we keeping current?" Deacon Williams, a man who'd known Marcus since seminary and had served as his closest advisor for 12 years, looked uncomfortable. "Anonymous donations. Members of the community who want to support our ministry." "Which members?" "Marcus, you don't want to know." But Marcus did want to know, and after an hour of careful questioning, the truth emerged. The church had been receiving regular contributions from people connected to the same organization that had killed David. Drug money had been keeping New Covenant Baptist Church alive for the past 3 years. "They're not evil people," Deacon Williams said, though he couldn't look Marcus in the eye. "They grew up here, their families are here. They support the church because they believe in what we're doing." What we're doing. Marcus felt something break inside him that would never repair itself. "We're taking money from the people who poisoned my son. We're surviving. This church provides hope to hundreds of families. Without that support..." Marcus stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the Murphy building. From his office, he could see young men moving in and out of the building's entrance, conducting business that everyone knew about and no one could stop. "How many other churches?" "What? How many other churches in the neighborhood take their money?" The silence lasted long enough for Marcus to understand that the corruption was total, that the enemy had infiltrated every institution designed to protect the community, including his own. That night, Marcus made a decision that would eventually lead to 15 deaths. He began keeping detailed records of everything he observed. License plates, times of day, faces of buyers and sellers, patterns of movement, relationships between different levels of the organization. But unlike previous community efforts to document criminal activity, Marcus wasn't gathering evidence for police. He was gathering intelligence for something else entirely. The transformation began gradually. Marcus continued performing his pastoral duties, visiting the sick, counseling troubled families, delivering sermons about hope and redemption. But privately, he was studying his enemy with the focused intensity of a military strategist. He read books about organized crime, about urban warfare, about the psychology of fear and control. He researched methods of investigation, of surveillance, of applying pressure to criminal organizations without triggering violent retaliation. Gloria noticed the change first. Her husband had become distant, spending long hours in his study, taking phone calls he wouldn't discuss, leaving the apartment at odd hours without explanation. When she asked about it, Marcus told her he was researching ways to help the community address the drug problem more effectively. "You're scaring me," she said one evening in November, 2 months after David's death. "You're not the same person." Marcus looked at his wife. The woman who'd stood beside him through 12 years of ministry, who'd raised their son to be everything they'd hoped for, who deserved better than to lose both her child and her husband to the same enemy, and realized she was right. He wasn't the same person. Reverend Marcus Washington was disappearing, being replaced by someone harder, someone angrier, someone capable of things the old Marcus would have considered unthinkable. Maybe the person I was wasn't good enough to protect our son. And maybe the person you're becoming won't be good enough to honor his memory. The warning should have stopped him, should have made him reconsider the path he was walking down, should have reminded him that David would have wanted his father to remain the good man who'd raised him. Instead, it convinced Marcus that he was already too far down the road to turn back. The final catalyst came in December, when another 17-year-old died from drugs purchased at the Murphy building. This time it was Maria Santos, a girl who'd been in David's graduating class, who'd planned to study nursing, who'd been clean for 8 months before a relapse killed her in her bedroom while her mother was at work. Marcus attended Maria's funeral and watched her mother collapse over the casket exactly as Gloria had collapsed in the hospital. He watched another family destroy itself with grief and guilt and unanswered questions. He listened to another police officer offer sympathy and excuses and promises of investigations that would lead nowhere. That night, Marcus wrote the first name on a list that would eventually contain 15 entries. The name was Jesus Martinez, known on the street as Preacher, a nickname that felt like mockery given Marcus's profession. Martinez was 19 years old, had been dealing drugs since he was 14, and was responsible for recruiting high school kids into the organization. According to Marcus's research, Martinez had specifically targeted both David and Maria Santos, had provided them with their first taste of heroin, had convinced them that they could handle it because they were smart kids who wouldn't become addicts like the junkies they saw on street corners. Martinez lived with his grandmother in a third-floor apartment 4 blocks from the church. He drove a modified Honda Civic with expensive rims and a sound system worth more than most people in the neighborhood made in 6 months. He wore gold chains and designer clothes and had never held a legitimate job in his life. He was charming, intelligent, and utterly without conscience when it came to destroying young lives for profit. Marcus spent 3 weeks learning Martinez's patterns, his habits, his relationships, his vulnerabilities. He learned that Martinez was afraid of his grandmother finding out about his activities, that he had asthma that required daily medication, that he always carried exactly $2,000 in cash as operating capital, and that he met his supplier every Tuesday night at a diner on Hunts Point Avenue. Most importantly, Marcus learned that Martinez was planning to recruit more high school students before Christmas, targeting kids who were struggling financially and might be tempted by quick money during the expensive holiday season. On December 18, 1994, Marcus Washington stopped being a minister and became something else entirely. It started simply enough. Marcus followed Martinez to the diner, waited outside in his Honda Civic, and watched as the young man met with his supplier, an older Puerto Rican man who arrived in a black Mercedes and conducted business with the efficiency of any other corporate transaction. When the meeting ended and Martinez walked to his car, Marcus was waiting for him. "Jesus," Marcus called out, using the young man's given name rather than his street nickname. Martinez turned, saw the neighborhood preacher approaching, and smiled with the easy confidence of someone who'd been untouchable for so long that fear had become foreign to him. "Reverend Washington, sorry about your son, man. That was messed up." Marcus stopped walking when he was close enough to see Martinez clearly in the streetlight. "You killed him." "What?" Martinez's smile faded. "Reverend, I don't know what you're talking about. I never even talked to David. You recruited him. You gave him his first taste. You convinced him it would be safe." Martinez looked around nervously. The diner parking lot was empty except for their 2 cars, and the street was quiet. "Look, Reverend, I think you got some bad information. Maybe you should go home, spend time with your wife. Grief does things to people's minds." Marcus reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small notebook filled with detailed observations about Martinez's activities. Tuesday nights at this diner, Thursday afternoons at the Murphy building, Friday evenings recruiting outside the high school, Saturday mornings visiting your grandmother, bringing her groceries bought with money you made poisoning children. You've been watching me. Martinez's hand moved instinctively toward his waistband, where Marcus suspected he carried a gun. I've been studying you, learning how you operate, who you work for, which kids you're targeting next. Marcus flipped through pages of meticulous notes. Did you know that Maria Santos called you the night she died? Did you know she begged you to help her get clean? Martinez's face hardened. That girl made her own choices, just like your son did. No, Marcus said quietly. They made the choices you gave them. The conversation that followed lasted 15 minutes and changed both of their lives forever. Marcus didn't threaten Martinez, didn't demand information, didn't try to scare him into leaving the neighborhood. Instead, he did something much more dangerous. He showed Martinez that someone was watching, someone was learning, someone was keeping track of every move he made and every life he destroyed. What you want from me, Reverend? Marcus closed his notebook and looked at the young man who'd killed his son. I want you to understand that actions have consequences. I want you to know that someone is finally paying attention. You threatening me. I'm educating you, the same way you educated my son about heroin. Marcus walked back to his car, leaving Martinez standing alone in the parking lot, with the uncomfortable realization that the rules of engagement in his territory had just changed. For 5 years, Martinez had operated with impunity, protected by community fear and police inefficiency. Now someone was watching him with the patience and intelligence to actually pose a threat. That night, Marcus went home and began planning his first real move against the organization that had killed David. Not violence, not yet, but something that would demonstrate that the neighborhood's children now had a protector who understood the enemy's methods and was willing to match their level of commitment. He had no idea that his education of Jesus Martinez would trigger a chain of events that would ultimately require 15 deaths to resolve. He only knew that his son deserved justice, and that justice apparently required a different kind of ministry than anything he'd learned in seminary. The war for Hunts Point was about to begin, and Reverend Marcus Washington was ready to become someone capable of winning it. The first body was discovered on January 15, 1995, exactly 1 month after Marcus's parking lot conversation with Jesus Martinez. The young dealer was found in the basement of an abandoned building on Fox Street, 2 miles from his usual territory, with what the medical examiner would later describe as signs of prolonged interrogation before death from cardiac arrest. No wounds, no obvious trauma, just the kind of stress-induced heart failure that might affect someone with severe asthma who'd been subjected to intense psychological pressure over an extended period. Marcus read about Martinez's death in the Bronx Herald while eating breakfast with Gloria, who was slowly returning to something resembling normal life after 2 months of devastating grief. She'd gone back to her job as a school secretary, had started attending church services again, and was seeing a counselor recommended by their family doctor. She was healing, or trying to, while Marcus was becoming something entirely different. Another drug dealer killed, Gloria said, reading over Marcus's shoulder. Jesus Martinez. Wasn't he one of the boys you've been worried about? Marcus folded the newspaper carefully, keeping his expression neutral. Yes, it's unfortunate. Another young life wasted. What he didn't tell his wife was that he'd spent 6 hours with Jesus Martinez in that basement on Fox Street, conducting what could only be described as an extended confession session. Marcus had learned things during those 6 hours that fundamentally changed his understanding of the enemy he was fighting and convinced him that traditional approaches to justice would never be sufficient. Martinez had talked, eventually, about the organization's structure, about protection money paid to police officers, about politicians who looked the other way in exchange for campaign contributions, about the systematic recruitment of children as young as 12. He'd talked about David specifically, about how they'd targeted the preacher's son because someone higher up the chain had wanted to send a message about the consequences of asking too many questions. But most importantly, Martinez had provided Marcus with a complete list of the organization's key personnel, their responsibilities, their territories, and their vulnerabilities. 15 names in total, ranging from street-level dealers to the administrative staff who laundered money through legitimate businesses. 15 people whose deaths would effectively destroy the drug operation that controlled 6 square blocks of the South Bronx and employed over 60 young men and women. Marcus had never intended to kill Martinez. The plan had been intimidation, information gathering, perhaps forcing the young dealer to leave the neighborhood voluntarily. But when Martinez began describing David's final days, how they'd deliberately given him increasingly pure heroin to create dependency, how they'd planned to use him to recruit other college-bound kids, how his death had been viewed as an acceptable business loss rather than a tragedy, something fundamental had shifted in Marcus's psychology. The cardiac arrest had been genuine. Martinez's asthma, combined with 6 hours of stress and the psychological pressure of facing someone who knew every detail of his crimes, had simply overwhelmed his system. Marcus had watched the young man die and felt nothing except regret that there were 14 more names on his list. The second death occurred 3 weeks later. Carmen Rodriguez was a 32-year-old woman who managed financial operations for the drug organization, washing money through a series of small businesses, including 2 bodegas, a car service, and a beauty salon. She was also the person who'd been recruiting teenage girls to work as couriers, convincing them they were safer carrying drugs than the boys, because police were less likely to search female suspects. Marcus had learned about Carmen from Jesus Martinez during their final conversation. She lived alone in a rent-stabilized apartment on Southern Boulevard, drove a late-model Toyota, and had a weakness for romantic novels and expensive shoes. She was intelligent, careful, and had never been arrested despite 5 years of criminal activity. She was also directly responsible for Maria Santos's death, having provided the pure heroin that had killed the 17-year-old nursing student. Marcus approached Carmen differently than he had Martinez. Instead of confrontation, he used ministry. He appeared at her apartment on a Tuesday evening, dressed in his clerical collar, carrying a Bible and wearing the expression of pastoral concern that had made him trusted in the community for 12 years. "Miss Rodriguez, I'm Reverend Washington from New Covenant Baptist. I'm visiting families in the neighborhood who might benefit from spiritual counseling." Carmen was suspicious but not alarmed. Marcus looked exactly like what he claimed to be, a middle-aged minister making house calls in a neighborhood where such visits were common. She invited him in for coffee, and they spent an hour discussing faith, family, and the challenges of living in the South Bronx. It wasn't until Marcus began asking specific questions about her financial responsibilities that Carmen realized she was in danger. By then, it was too late. Carmen Rodriguez died from what appeared to be a drug overdose in her own apartment. The medical examiner found heroin in her system, the same pure heroin that had killed David Washington and Maria Santos. To investigating officers, it looked like another case of a drug dealer sampling their own product with fatal results. They didn't look closely enough to notice that Carmen had been injected with enough heroin to kill 3 people, or that her apartment showed signs of having been searched by someone looking for specific information. Marcus had found what he was looking for in Carmen's bedroom closet: detailed financial records showing exactly how the drug organization moved money, which businesses they controlled, which officials they'd corrupted, and most importantly, who was scheduled to receive their next shipment of heroin. The third death was different, strategic rather than personal. Detective Ray Morales was a 15-year veteran of the NYPD who'd been assigned to investigate the deaths of Jesus Martinez and Carmen Rodriguez. He was also receiving $5,000 per month to ensure that investigations into drug activity around the Murphy building proceeded slowly and produced no meaningful results. Marcus had identified Morales through Carmen's records, which included careful documentation of payments to various officials. The detective had been protecting the drug organization for 3 years, during which time 17 young people had died from overdoses in his patrol area. Marcus didn't approach Morales directly. Instead, he spent 2 weeks learning the detective's routines, his vulnerabilities, his secrets. Morales was divorced, drank heavily, and was struggling with gambling debts that made the drug money irresistible despite his better instincts. He was also genuinely tormented by the contradiction between his oath as a police officer and his financial arrangement with criminals. The detective was found dead in his car outside a Yonkers casino, apparently the victim of a heart attack brought on by stress and alcohol. The medical examiner noted high levels of anxiety medication in his system, medication that hadn't been prescribed to him, but which might explain his cardiac episode. Morales had apparently been taking unprescribed benzodiazepines to manage job-related stress. What the medical examiner didn't note was that the medication had been administered involuntarily, mixed into drinks that Morales had consumed during an evening of gambling that Marcus had carefully orchestrated. The detective had died believing he'd lost everything at poker, unaware that his opponent had been the father of one of his victims. Marcus had learned something important from Detective Morales' death. Killing police officers, even corrupt ones, attracted attention that street-level dealer deaths did not. The NYPD began investigating Morales' financial situation, discovered his connection to the drug organization, and started applying real pressure to criminal operations in the area. This forced Marcus to accelerate his timeline. The fourth and fifth deaths occurred on the same night, targeting the organization's suppliers rather than street-level personnel. Miguel Santana and his brother Roberto controlled drug distribution for a significant portion of the South Bronx, operating out of a warehouse in Hunts Point that officially stored auto parts but actually served as a distribution center for heroin arriving from connections in Manhattan. They were careful, professional, and had never been directly linked to any deaths because they didn't sell to users, only to dealers like Jesus Martinez. Marcus had learned about the Santana brothers from Detective Morales, who'd provided detailed information about their operation during a conversation that lasted most of the night before his death. The brothers met every Thursday at their warehouse to count money and plan distribution for the following week. They brought muscle, but conducted their meetings in a soundproof office that isolated them from their security. Marcus spent 3 weeks preparing for the Santana brothers, learning everything about their operation, their building, their security arrangements. This would be his most complex operation yet, requiring precise timing and sophisticated planning. On Thursday, February 23rd, Marcus entered the Santana warehouse through a delivery entrance he'd been monitoring for weeks. He knew the building's layout, knew which cameras had been disabled by budget cuts, knew that the security guards took 30-minute breaks at predictable intervals. Miguel and Roberto Santana died from carbon monoxide poisoning in their soundproof office, victims of a faulty heating system that had been sabotaged hours earlier. To investigating officers, it appeared to be an industrial accident. 2 businessmen killed by inadequate ventilation while working late at their legitimate auto parts business. Marcus had watched them die through the office window, observing as they gradually lost consciousness while counting money that represented the destruction of children's lives. They'd gone peacefully, unaware that their deaths were anything other than tragic accidents. With the Santana brothers dead, the drug organization lost its primary supply chain and began fracturing into smaller, competing groups. This created opportunities for Marcus to target middle management without triggering unified retaliation. The 6th death was personal. Lieutenant Patricia Gonzalez had been running interference for the drug organization at the precinct level for 4 years, ensuring that investigations were misdirected, evidence disappeared, and arrests focused on expendable street dealers rather than organizational leadership. She was also the supervising officer who'd handled David Washington's case, filing a report that characterized his death as accidental overdose by inexperienced user rather than targeted poisoning. Gonzalez was careful, intelligent, and completely insulated from street-level activity. She lived in Westchester County, drove a BMW she couldn't afford on a police salary, and sent her children to private schools paid for with drug money. Marcus had learned about Gonzalez through Detective Morales' confession, but reaching her required resources he'd been developing since December. The insurance payout from David's life insurance policy, a modest $15,000 policy the church had provided, gave Marcus the financial flexibility to expand his operations beyond the immediate neighborhood. Lieutenant Gonzalez died in what appeared to be a home invasion robbery in her Westchester home. The scene suggested that multiple perpetrators had tortured her for information about valuables before killing her and staging a burglary. Local police focused their investigation on known home invasion crews from the Bronx and Manhattan. Marcus had spent 8 hours in Gonzalez's home, learning everything she knew about police corruption, about which other officials were compromised, about how the drug organization had infiltrated law enforcement at multiple levels. Her death yielded information that would make the remaining 9 killings possible. But it also marked the point where Marcus Washington fully transformed into someone his son would no longer recognize. By March of 1995, the South Bronx drug organization was in chaos. 5 key personnel had died in what appeared to be unrelated incidents. Their supply chain had been disrupted, and police pressure was intensifying following the investigation into Detective Morales's financial situation. Street dealers were nervous, middle management was paranoid, and the remaining leadership was beginning to suspect that someone was systematically targeting their operation. Marcus had become a student of fear, learning how to use psychological pressure as effectively as physical violence. He began leaving subtle signs that someone was watching the surviving members of his list. Photographs slipped under car windshields, detailed information about their daily routines left in their mailboxes, copies of newspaper articles about the recent deaths delivered to their homes. The 7th death was designed to send a message. Antonio Vega was the organization's chief enforcer, responsible for maintaining discipline within their ranks and intimidating community members who might cooperate with police. He was suspected of at least 12 murders, including 2 teenagers who tried to start independent drug operations in adjacent territories. Vega was found dead in the Murphy building itself, in the same room where David Washington had overdosed 4 months earlier. His death appeared to be a gang-style execution, multiple gunshot wounds from close range, professional execution technique, body positioned to send a clear message about the consequences of betraying organizational loyalty. The reality was more complex. Marcus had spent weeks gaining Vega's trust, approaching him as a grieving minister, seeking information about his son's death, gradually building a relationship based on Vega's unexpected respect for religious authority. The enforcer had eventually agreed to meet privately with Marcus, believing he could provide information that would help the preacher find peace. Vega had died quickly, professionally, and with the knowledge that his death was justice for David Washington and 11 other young people he'd killed over the past 3 years. Marcus had used Vega's own gun, leaving it at the scene to suggest organizational infighting rather than external assassination. With Antonio Vega dead, the remaining organization members began turning on each other, suspecting internal betrayal rather than external attack. This paranoia made Marcus's final operations significantly easier. The 8th through 13th deaths occurred over 6 weeks, targeting the remaining middle management and street supervisors whose activities had directly contributed to deaths in the community. Each death appeared unrelated to the others. Accidents, overdoses, apparent gang violence, and domestic disputes that suggested a crime organization destroying itself through internal conflict. Marcus had become efficient, systematic, and completely detached from the emotional weight of his actions. Each death was a mathematical equation. 1 less person poisoning children equals X number of young lives saved. He'd reduced human beings to variables in a larger calculation about community survival. The 14th death almost stopped everything. Dr. Elena Vasquez was a physician who'd been prescribing medication to drug dealers, providing medical treatment for organization members, and falsifying death certificates to protect the group from murder investigations. She'd also been the doctor who'd pronounced David Washington dead, though Marcus hadn't known about her connections to his son's killers until he'd worked his way through the rest of his list. Dr. Vasquez died in what appeared to be a medical accident, an allergic reaction to medication she'd been taking for anxiety. The reaction occurred in her private practice after hours, and her body wasn't discovered until the following morning. Marcus had been careful, professional, and emotionally detached as always, but when he'd searched Dr. Vasquez's office for records related to her criminal activities, he'd discovered something that almost broke his resolve: David's medical file, marked with notations suggesting that his death had been expected, planned, and celebrated as a successful test of a new heroin formula. His son had been a laboratory experiment. Marcus sat in Dr. Vasquez's office for 3 hours after her death, reading medical records that detailed exactly how his son had been murdered, learning that David's overdose had been the culmination of a month-long process designed to test the effects of progressively stronger heroin doses on previously clean users. For the first time since beginning his campaign of justice, Marcus Washington broke down and wept, but he didn't stop. One name remained on his list. The 15th death would be the most important, the most dangerous, and the most personal of all. The last name on Marcus's list belonged to a man who didn't exist in any official records, who had no fingerprints on file with police, who paid taxes under 3 different identities and owned property, through a maze of shell corporations that would have impressed Wall Street money launderers. The man called himself Father Miguel, though he'd never been ordained by any legitimate religious institution, and he ran his drug empire with the methodical precision of someone who understood that true power came not from violence, but from becoming indispensable to everyone around him. Father Miguel controlled 7 different drug territories across the South Bronx, employed over 200 people in various capacities, and had been operating for 15 years without ever being arrested, indicted, or even seriously investigated. He achieved this immunity through a combination of careful planning, strategic corruption, and a genuine understanding of community needs that made him more effective than most legitimate social service organizations. The man who'd ordered David Washington's death wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. He was a 53-year-old grandfather who attended Mass every Sunday at St. Augustine's Catholic Church, who donated regularly to local food banks, who'd put 17 neighborhood kids through college with scholarships funded by drug profits. He lived modestly in a 2-bedroom apartment above a bakery he owned, drove a 15-year-old Buick, and was widely respected as someone who genuinely cared about the community's welfare. He was also responsible for more deaths than any serial killer in American history, having perfected a system that turned children into addicts, addicts into dealers, and dealers into corpses with the efficiency of an industrial assembly line. Marcus had learned about Father Miguel through the confessions of 14 dead people, piecing together a portrait of criminal leadership that was far more sophisticated and dangerous than anything he'd expected. This wasn't a traditional drug lord motivated by money and power. This was someone who understood that controlling a community required providing services that legitimate institutions couldn't or wouldn't offer. Father Miguel's organization provided jobs for unemployed teenagers, loans for struggling families, protection for elderly residents, and medical care for people without health insurance. They mediated neighborhood disputes, provided emergency assistance during crises, and maintained order more effectively than any police presence. In exchange, the community maintained a code of silence that made Father Miguel's drug operation essentially untouchable. David Washington had died because he'd been researching this system for his sociology project, getting too close to understanding how it functioned, asking questions that threatened to expose the careful balance that kept everyone alive and fed while slowly poisoning their children. Marcus spent 3 months learning about Father Miguel, studying a man who was simultaneously the community's greatest protector and its most deadly enemy. The research required resources beyond anything Marcus had previously employed, forcing him to travel outside the Bronx, to develop contacts in other boroughs, to learn techniques of investigation that bordered on professional intelligence work. He discovered that Father Miguel's real name was Miguel Santos, that he'd grown up in Hunts Point during the 1960s when the neighborhood was beginning its long decline, that he'd watched his own father die from a heroin overdose in 1971. He'd started dealing drugs at age 16, not for money but to control the quality of narcotics in his neighborhood, trying to prevent other families from suffering what his had experienced. Somewhere along the way, Miguel Santos had convinced himself that he was protecting the community by controlling its drug trade, rather than allowing it to be run by outsiders who had no investment in local welfare. He'd built an organization that was genuinely committed to community service, while simultaneously destroying that same community through systematic addiction. It was the most sophisticated form of evil Marcus had ever encountered, evil that genuinely believed itself to be good, that could point to real benefits it provided while ignoring the fundamental destruction it caused. Killing Father Miguel would require everything Marcus had learned over 8 months of systematic murder. The man was protected by loyal associates, warned by an efficient intelligence network, and insulated by community support that was both genuine and pragmatic. He was also the only person who could provide answers to the questions that had been driving Marcus since David's death. Why had his son been specifically targeted? Who had made the decision to use David as a test subject? What had David learned that made him dangerous enough to kill? Marcus knew that approaching Father Miguel directly would be suicide. The man's organization had been watching for threats ever since the systematic elimination of their personnel had begun. They'd connected at least some of the deaths, had increased security measures, and were actively hunting for whoever was destroying their operation. The solution came from an unexpected source: Gloria. Marcus's wife had been watching her husband's transformation with growing alarm, noticing changes that went far beyond normal grief. Marcus had lost 20 pounds, had developed an intensity that made casual conversation impossible, and had begun displaying knowledge about criminal activity that couldn't be explained by pastoral concern. Most troubling, he'd started leaving the apartment at all hours without explanation, returning with a detachment that suggested he'd been doing things that were changing him in fundamental ways. In April, Gloria confronted her husband with a direct question that forced him to make a choice between his mission and his marriage. "Marcus, are you killing people?" They were sitting in their kitchen on a Wednesday evening, sharing dinner in silence, as had become their custom. Marcus had been planning his approach to Father Miguel, considering various scenarios for getting close enough to the man to extract information and execute justice. He'd been lost in thought about surveillance patterns and security vulnerabilities when Gloria's question hit him like a physical blow. "What did you say?" "I asked if you're killing people." Gloria's voice was steady, though her hands shook as she spoke. 15 people connected to drug activity in this neighborhood have died since David's funeral. 15 people who you'd researched, who you'd been watching, who you knew were responsible for our son's death. Marcus stared at his wife, realizing that she'd been conducting her own investigation while he'd been focused on his mission. "Gloria, I found your notebooks, Marcus. Names, addresses, daily routines, detailed observations about people's habits and vulnerabilities. I found newspaper clippings about deaths that match your research. I found receipts for equipment and supplies that have no connection to church business." The conversation that followed lasted 6 hours and changed both of their lives irrevocably. Marcus told Gloria everything about David's murder, about the systematic corruption he'd discovered, about the 14 executions he'd carried out, and about his plans for Father Miguel. He explained his reasoning, his methodology, his conviction that traditional justice had failed so completely that direct action was the only remaining option. Gloria listened without interruption until Marcus finished speaking. Then she asked a single question that cut through 8 months of rationalization and self-justification. "What would David think of what you've become?" Marcus had no answer. The son who'd planned to study social work, who'd believed in systemic change and community organizing, who'd wanted to help troubled kids through education and opportunity rather than violence, would have been horrified by his father's campaign of murder. "I can't let them get away with killing our son." "They didn't get away with it. You killed them all." Gloria's voice carried a sadness that was worse than anger. "But you also killed yourself, Marcus. You killed the man I married, the man who raised David, the man who believed that love was stronger than hate." Gloria gave Marcus an ultimatum: stop his mission immediately, turn himself in to authorities, and try to salvage what remained of their life together, or continue his pursuit of Father Miguel and lose her forever. Marcus chose his mission. The divorce papers were filed on May 15, 1995. Gloria moved in with her sister in Queens, took a job at a different school district, and began the process of rebuilding her life without the 2 men she'd loved most in the world. She left Marcus alone in their apartment above the laundromat, surrounded by evidence of 14 murders and plans for a 15th that had become an obsession rather than justice. Gloria's departure forced Marcus to confront what he'd become, but it didn't change his determination to complete his list. If anything, losing his wife strengthened his conviction that David's death required absolute resolution, that any compromise or half-measure would make all the previous deaths meaningless. Father Miguel, meanwhile, had reached his own conclusions about the systematic destruction of his organization. Through careful investigation and elimination of other possibilities, he'd identified Reverend Marcus Washington as the most likely source of his problems. The preacher had motive, opportunity, and had demonstrated intelligence-gathering capabilities that suggested professional training or exceptional natural ability. Father Miguel's response was characteristically sophisticated. Rather than ordering Marcus's death or attempting to intimidate him, he chose to make contact directly, arranging a meeting that would give both men the opportunity to resolve their conflict through negotiation rather than violence. The meeting was arranged through Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who owned the laundromat below Marcus's apartment. On May 20th, she delivered a message that Father Miguel would like to speak with Reverend Washington about matters of mutual concern and that such a conversation could be beneficial to everyone involved. Marcus knew it was a trap, but he also knew it might be his only opportunity to get close enough to Father Miguel to finish what David's death had started. He agreed to meet at neutral ground, St. Augustine's Catholic Church, during evening mass, when the building would be full of witnesses and neither man could risk violence. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything Marcus had prepared for. Father Miguel was waiting in the last pew when Marcus arrived, a small dignified man who looked exactly like what he claimed to be, a concerned community member attending religious services. He was alone, unarmed, and completely relaxed as Marcus approached. "Reverend Washington," Father Miguel said quietly, not turning around. "Thank you for coming. Please sit." Marcus sat beside the man who'd ordered his son's death, both of them facing the altar where a priest was conducting evening mass in Spanish for 37 parishioners who had no idea they were witnessing the final confrontation in a war that had killed 15 people. "You've been very thorough," Father Miguel said, "very professional. I'm impressed by your commitment. I'm here to finish what you started when you killed my son." "I didn't kill your son, Reverend. I gave him an opportunity to understand how the world actually works, and he made choices based on that understanding. The same choices thousands of young people make every day." Marcus felt rage building in his chest, the same cold fury that had sustained him through 8 months of planning and execution. "You murdered him to test your product. I educated him about the realities of power in his community. David was the intelligent young man who asked dangerous questions about systems he didn't understand. Rather than simply eliminating him, I offered him the chance to learn those systems from the inside. By getting him addicted to heroin, by showing him that idealistic college students who write sociology papers about drug organizations without understanding their actual function in the community tend to get themselves and others killed." Father Miguel turned to look at Marcus for the first time, and his eyes carried genuine sadness. "Your son's death wasn't business, Reverend. It was education. The same education I'm offering you now." The conversation that followed lasted through the entire Mass, conducted in whispers while around them families prayed for protection, for guidance, for the kinds of miracles that Marcus had once believed possible. Father Miguel explained his philosophy, his methodology, his genuine conviction that he was serving the community by controlling forces that would otherwise destroy it completely. "Do you know what happens if my organization disappears?" Father Miguel asked. "Other groups move in. Groups from Manhattan, from New Jersey, from places where children are just customers and communities are just markets. Groups that don't provide jobs or loans or protection or medical care. Groups that take everything and give nothing back. And you think that justifies poisoning children? I think it justifies controlling how children are poisoned rather than allowing that process to happen without any community input or protection." Marcus listened to Father Miguel's justifications and realized he was hearing the voice of someone who'd traveled the same path Marcus was walking, someone who'd started with good intentions and convinced himself that evil actions were justified by beneficial results. Father Miguel had begun exactly as Marcus had, as a community member trying to protect children from drugs, and had ended up becoming the very thing he'd fought against. "You're trying to save me," Marcus said. I'm trying to save the community you're about to destroy. Your campaign against my organization has created a power vacuum that will be filled by people far worse than anyone you've killed. Father Miguel offered Marcus a choice: accept a position within his organization, help him rebuild with better protections for community children, and use his intelligence and commitment to create a drug operation that genuinely served neighborhood interests rather than exploiting them. The alternative was war, a conflict that would destroy both men and leave the community defenseless against outside criminal organizations that were already moving to fill the void Marcus's killings had created. Marcus Washington sat in a Catholic church, listening to a mass conducted in a language he didn't speak, and realized that he faced the same choice his son had confronted 6 months earlier: accept the reality of a corrupt system and find a way to work within it, or maintain his principles and risk destroying everything he'd tried to protect. For the first time since David's death, Marcus understood that there were no good choices remaining. The decision he made in those final moments would determine not only his own fate, but the future of a community that had already paid an enormous price for his pursuit of justice. Marcus reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the small caliber pistol he'd been carrying for 3 months. Father Miguel didn't flinch, didn't try to escape, didn't call for help. He simply watched as Marcus made his final choice. "My son wanted to be a social worker," Marcus said quietly. "I know," Father Miguel replied. "He would have been very good at it." Marcus Washington, former minister, current serial killer, and father of a murdered child, raised his weapon and fired twice into Father Miguel's chest, killing him instantly in the back pew of St. Augustine's Catholic Church, while 37 witnesses prayed for peace. The gunshots echoed through the sanctuary, stopping the mass, sending parishioners diving for cover, and ending an 8-month campaign that had killed 15 people and transformed a grieving father into something that would haunt the South Bronx for years to come. Marcus made no attempt to escape. He sat beside Father Miguel's body, holding the smoking pistol, and waited for police to arrive. When Detective Rodriguez, the same officer who'd taken his statement the night David died, handcuffed him 20 minutes later, Marcus Washington spoke his final words as a free man: "It's finished." The trial that followed was brief and conclusive. Marcus Washington pled guilty to 15 counts of murder in the first degree, accepting full responsibility for what prosecutors called the most systematic campaign of vigilante killing in New York City history. He refused legal representation, declined to offer any justification for his actions, and accepted a life sentence without possibility of parole. The aftermath was everything Father Miguel had predicted. 3 rival drug organizations moved into the power vacuum left by his death, bringing with them levels of violence and exploitation that made the previous system seem benevolent by comparison. Within 6 months, 12 more children had died from drug overdoses, gang violence had increased by 300%, and the community protections that Father Miguel's organization had provided, jobs, loans, security, medical care, had disappeared entirely. The neighborhood that Marcus Washington had tried to save was destroyed more completely by his success than it had ever been by the drug organization he'd dismantled. Gloria Washington never visited her husband in prison. She testified during his sentencing hearing, asking the court to remember David Washington as he'd actually been, a young man who believed in hope, in change, in the possibility that communities could heal themselves through love rather than violence. "My husband became the very thing our son died trying to understand," she said. "He let grief and anger transform him into someone who believed that murder was justice, that destruction was protection. David would have wanted his death to inspire healing, not revenge. Marcus chose revenge, and in doing so, he dishonored everything our son stood for." Marcus Washington died in Attica Correctional Facility on November 15, 2003, 8 years after David's death. He was found in his cell, apparently having suffered a heart attack during the night. Prison officials noted that he'd been reading a sociology textbook, the same textbook David had been using for his research project when he was killed. The last entry in Marcus's prison journal, written the day before his death, consisted of a single question: was David's life worth 15 other lives, or were all 16 deaths equally meaningless? He never answered that question, Perhaps there was no answer that could satisfy a father's love, a community's needs, or the arithmetic of justice in a world where protecting children sometimes requires becoming the very monster you're trying to defeat. The Bronx Blood War, as local newspapers eventually called it, ended not with resolution, but with exhaustion. A community too damaged to continue fighting, a family destroyed by the cost of seeking justice, and 15 graves that marked the boundary between righteousness and revenge. David Washington's sociology project was never completed. His research notes discovered in his bedroom after the trial revealed that he'd been working on a thesis about how communities could organize themselves to address drug problems through education, economic opportunity, and social support, rather than enforcement and punishment. He'd believed that love was stronger than fear, that healing was possible, and that even the most damaged communities could save themselves if they chose hope over violence. His father had chosen differently, and the weight of that choice would haunt everyone who'd known them both for the rest of their lives. In the end, the only victory belonged to the drugs themselves, still flowing through the South Bronx, still killing children, still offering the promise of easy money to teenagers who saw no other path forward. The system that had killed David Washington survived his father's campaign of justice, adapted to the temporary disruption, and continued operating with the mechanical efficiency of a machine designed to transform hope into profit. Marcus Washington's war had changed nothing except the specific names on the casualty lists. Perhaps that was the most honest form of justice possible in a world where good intentions and evil actions often became indistinguishable, where fathers' love could become children's destruction, and where the arithmetic of revenge never balanced the equations it claimed to solve. The last word belonged to David, written in the margins of his sociology textbook. Communities heal themselves through connection, not separation, through building up, not tearing down, through love that's stronger than the fear that makes people hurt each other. Marcus Washington had forgotten that lesson in the darkness following his son's death. The community had paid the price for that forgetting, and would continue paying long after everyone involved was dead and buried. Justice, it turned out, was far more complicated than any father's love could solve.